Welcome to the Wheel of Time Diaries. I am your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today, this week, is the penultimate episode of this series, which is a really weird thing to say, but today we're going to be covering some bonus material related to the Wheel of Time, none of the actual 14 books or the prequel, because I've done my spoiler talks on all of those. Of course, last week I did just wrap up A Memory of Light, and that was certainly an experience, but after finishing the series, there were couple moments over the last couple months where I was looking into a couple of things, information that I had heard about auxiliary material that had been cut from A Memory of Light that Brandon Sanderson had written and that was released elsewhere. And that also got me on a similar topic of a couple of things that Robert Jordan had written that for the series, predominantly that I also had not quite read yet, and that I decided that I wanted to read all of and cover in its own diary. Now, for the purposes of today's video, we're just covering 4 short pieces of fiction. We're not covering any of the companion, we're not covering the world of Wheel of Time, we're not covering any of that kind of stuff, but we are covering earlier Ravens, which is I guess you could say it's a bonus prologue to Eye of the World, which in my hardcover edition of that first book of the series, that is not in there, so I had not read that yet, and so I read it recently. The Strike at Shayol Ghul is a sort of academically related piece that Robert Jordan wrote at some point in the midway of the series. I don't know exactly when that was written, but it was something that was written and made available. It is currently available online both at dragonmount.com and tarvalon.net, so I read it through one of those mediums, and it's basically covering a little bit of the end of the Age of Legends, the end of the Second Age, kind of we'll talk about it a little bit later, but there's a little bit more of it's slightly more non-fiction within the world of the Wheel of Time, as opposed to, earlier Ravens, which is a secondary prologue to Eye of the World, and then also a little bit different from the bonus material that I alluded to earlier, having been cut from A Memory of Light. This being a sort of novelette, you could call it, a short story maybe, called River of Souls, which is a collection of scenes from A Memory of Light that are generally considered to be canon within the series. At least the events of that story or of that collection of scenes seem to be canon, but they were ultimately cut from A Memory of Light for pacing and focus reasons, and I can see why. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. And then there was another set of scenes which were a little bit more substantial, comprising closer to a full novella in length, and that is A Fire Within the Ways, which was also more scenes cut from A Memory of Light, but these ones considered non-canon for pretty obvious reasons when you read it, because there are multiple things in there that happen differently from how they happen in the book. There are things from that sequence of scenes that are repurposed in the final book because the way that those scenes were actually playing out in the moment weren't quite working in a way that was going to fit within the context of the book. I spent about 4.5 hours reading all of these 4 bonus stories, A Fire Within the Ways notably taking over 2 hours of that time, so, the other 3 pieces weren't super long. I guess the bonus prologue to Eye of the World did take an hour or more, a little over an hour, actually. That's kind of surprising, but it certainly did, and maybe it's not really that surprising because that's just how Robert Jordan rolls, but let's go ahead and jump into the spoiler-free impressions portion of today's episode, just kind of what I thought about this bonus material and generally how I think it fits within the context of the series and reading the series. Earlier Ravens, I guess I'll just call it Ravens because it's easier to just call it Ravens, that extra prologue to Eye of the Worlds, I think generally was pretty solid. I'm not 100% convinced that I would want it to be an Eye of the World, like coming from the perspective of a first-time reader. I know that I have at least one friend who has told me that he appreciated it within that book when he read it way back in the day, a handful of years ago. For myself, I'm not 100% sure if I'm really like missing Ravens. You know, if I were to go back and transport myself back 3 years ago to when I first started Eye of the World, would I have wanted this extra prologue to be in there? And I think the answer to that question is probably not, actually. And there's a couple reasons for that that we'll discuss in the spoiler section a little bit later, but it's solid. You know, it's a fun little extra piece of material from earlier in the series than even the very first moment of the book. You know, it's a handful of years before that. But again, I'm not entirely sure that I could be convinced that this is like missing from the book. If I were somebody reading Eye of the World for the first time, I don't know that I would actually read this at that point. It might be something that you could read at some point later, but it's hard to say when later would be the most appropriate time. For me, finishing the series, it was more like, hey, that was pretty solid, and that was basically all that I got from it. But ironically, it actually also made for a fine pairing with the strike at Shayol Ghul. So maybe the time that you read Ravens at the same time, basically, as the strike at Shayol Ghul would also kind of work, because topically, Ravens also touches on some of the stuff that Strike does. And Strike is also pretty solid as another little bonus material thing from Robert Jordan. One of the main things of note is the fact that it is, like I said, a little bit more of an academic perspective type of writing. It's not the typical prose or storytelling of the rest of the series. It is more like an in-world text document, lore document, I suppose you could say. And in that sense, you know, it's a little bit of a different reading experience. I can definitely say that the writing is handily different. And in that way, that was actually kind of nice to see that the writing was so much different. It took a little bit of adjusting and getting used to, but I liked the material a good bit, especially since I read it right after having read Ravens, and them to a certain extent covering some of the same topics and themes, and also having just finished the series. I thought that they kind of worked together within that context of being read together, at least for me, they did. And so in that way, you know, I would say that there are two places where I might potentially recommend reading The Strike at Shayol Ghul, and the first one of those potential places is after The Gathering Storm. Reason being some of the themes, topics, and ideas of what that little bit of lore is actually covering are actually like kind of introduced isn't the right term, but it's like actually properly brought into the narrative within The Gathering Storm in a way that makes it a little bit more like forefront on your mind as the reader. So right after finishing The Gathering Storm, I was actually debating reading The Strike at Shayol Ghul right then, because I knew the topic that he was covering, and therefore, based off of what I read in The Gathering Storm, I was like, this would actually probably be a decent time to read that, wouldn't it? And having read it now, I agree that you could read it after The Gathering Storm, and that would be an appropriate time to read it. I'm not sure if there's any other place earlier in the series where I would necessarily recommend it, where it isn't necessarily forefront enough for me to say that, yeah, you should do that. I would say after The Gathering Storm works, or otherwise waiting until you are done with the series, because after you've had the climax, the end of the third age, going back and exploring a little bit of that material from the end of the second age with that in context is actually kind of really nice. It was actually pretty cool to get to experience that in that sense. And so in that way, I guess like my real recommendation for where to read these is after the end of the series, basically. If you read The Strike at Shayol Ghul and Ravens together, you get a little bit of the same topic being covered in a couple of different ways, in ways that are reminiscent of some things earlier in the series after you've just wrapped up the entire thing. And in that way, I thought it was worth it. I thought it was cool. So that's my basic spoiler-free thoughts on those two stories. As for River of Souls and A Fire Within the Ways, it's a little bit harder to talk about these in a non-spoiler context, just because the reasons why they were cut are so like intrinsically linked to what the material of the stories are. But we'll say, for the purposes of the spoiler-free section here, River of Souls, I totally understand why this was cut from A Memory of Light. You know, it was one of those things where going into the book, it's just like, could it really be like that jarring or that different? You know, could it really be justified to have been cut from the book? Would it really be affecting the book that much? And yeah, having read it now after the fact, I totally 100% agree. It would be very distracting in terms of focus and in terms of pacing from the way that A Memory of Light in general is structured and paced. And so I understand why River of Souls is missing from A Memory of Light, but I think that River of Souls is still very good material to read, to the degree that I would actually arguably recommend people read it before A Memory of Light. It's one of those things where, you know, hindsight being 2020, of course, if there was the foresight to inject these scenes throughout Towers of Midnight instead, that would actually be a really fitting time for those scenes to have been included within the series. That would work really well, and you could have those scenes within the series and have that little bit of extra build-up and active foreshadowing for a particular thing injected into the series, something that I think is actually, it's not vital, like you don't absolutely need it, but I would have appreciated a particular event of A Memory of Light a lot more if there was a little bit of active foreshadowing that is found within these scenes, and so these scenes being included would have been great. So as far as recommendation, I would tell people reading the series for the first time, read River of Souls in between Towers of Midnight and A Memory of Light, because they're good. River of Souls is good and it's short, and because the scenes are canon and take away from A Memory of Light, that they should be read right before you read A Memory of Light, so that you can see, like, there's that material that was going to be included in the book but then couldn't be because of real technical reasons. So River of Souls is great. It was definitely my favorite one of these like little side material things. If we were to give things ratings, I think I would give Ravens like 3 stars, Strike at Shayol Ghul like 3.5 stars, and I would give River of Souls 5 stars, and then A Fire Within the Ways I would actually give like 4.5 stars. I'm actually a bit concerned here. I totally forgot to even include notes about what happened in A Fire Within the Ways, but fortunately it's been recently enough that I think I can remember for the purposes of the spoiler section when we get there in a bit. Like I said before, A Fire Within the Ways is non-canon, so reading this as a little bonus to the Wheel of Time is kind of optional, and I would say whether you should or not is kind of up to you, and also kind of up to your preferences of certain things within the series. For myself, I was a little bit disappointed in A Memory of Light that the ways didn't really get utilized or come up within the story, and so A Fire Within the Ways being set within the ways, as the title may or may not imply here, is something that I think is worth doing so that you can kind of see what the intent with the ways originally was, even though these scenes ultimately got cut for various different technical reasons relating to the timeline and just technicalities. It apparently was like pulling teeth already just to get these scenes, just to get this sequence of events as good as it was, and it still wasn't quite clicking the way that it needed to, and so it got scrapped and some of the more important bits were repurposed elsewhere into the final book. This is another case, like with River of Souls. I understand why that decision was made, but I'm also made slightly more disappointed by A Memory of Light because of having read A Fire Within the Ways, ironically enough, because, again, the ways were something that I wanted to see utilized, and I do think that basically all of the things that appear within this novella's worth of writing that are either repurposed or no longer appear within the final book are better in A Fire Within the Ways than they are in the final book. And so I feel like kind of torn a little bit about this story because I see why it was taken out for the reasons that it was. But I do think it was actually possible to include this sequence more or less the way that it does. It just would have taken a lot more time to really get it to fit properly. And the unfortunate thing is that it apparently, like I said, already took a lot of time just to get the scenes to where they were. And putting in the amount of extra time to make them click with the book probably wouldn't have been worth the amount of time it would have taken to actually get that perfectly right. Because it would have taken, I can already tell, like, just looking at it more objectively, like, it would have taken a lot of work to get it to work. But, like, selfishly, I kind of wish that effort had been taken, because I do think Fire Within the Ways is great. And the only reason why I think it's the only reason why it's a 4.5 star for me, like, just technically speaking, instead of 5, is because it's a little bit messy. And it's a little bit messy because it didn't get to that final place that it ideally would have gotten to if it had, been given the extra time to actually been allowed to click, I guess. I know that sentence probably didn't make sense, but I think you can kind of see what I'm saying here. Fire Within the Ways is really good, and although it is, like, sort of a little bit messy in terms of, like, the actual tone and some of the interactions between certain characters and dialogue and stuff like that, that's the kind of thing that would have been touched up as it was continuing to be, dealt with in the book. And so, I just, again, selfishly just kind of wish that this sequence had been put into the book instead of some of the other decisions that were made in the final. And partially because, satisfying the way that the ways are kind of utilized within the series, and utilizing them in this final book would have been very impactful and meaningful. But at this point, we're basically just skirting the edges of what should just be spoiler talk. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into this section and just give a little bit more of my impressions in a slightly more spoiler-filled context for the people who either have read these shorts or who don't care to read the shorts themselves for whatever reason. So let's go ahead and circle back around to Ravens, the bonus prologue for Eye of the World, and talk about the spoilers of this, and just kind of very briefly summarize what the prologue was about. Basically, you are following Egwene's POV here instead of Rand's, which that in and of itself I think was a good decision for this little bonus prologue. If you're going to read it, it's nice to have a little bit of view of the two rivers and of the other characters from Egwene's POV, because this does take place a handful of years before the primary series actually begins, because Egwene is only like 9 years old here. And you get to see what a little bit of this is like from her POV, because she does ultimately become, arguably like the second main character of the series, depending on how you want to look at it. I find her storyline to be more vital than Perrin's or Mat's, for example. I think that to balance Rand out, I think Egwene is the other main character of the series. I think it is just as much about her storyline, what's going on with all the politics of the White Tower, as it is to know about what's going on with Rand and, him being the Dragon Reborn. And so getting to experience a little bit of what, this extra prologue does is it gives you a slight view of that. It gives you a slight view of the two rivers from a younger version of Egwene. It gives you a little bit of experience with some of the other main characters. You get to view a little bit of Mat and Perrin and Rand from young Egwene's perspective, as opposed to, her perspective later in the series. And, like, that's kind of an enlightening thing, because you don't really get to see some of those dynamics. You don't see some of those elements. You don't see some of that pull through when you're reading Eye of the World from Rand's POV. And so having a slightly extra perspective to do a little bit of that, I thought was really nice. It was really great. You get to see Egwene observing Perrin's timid protectiveness. That's kind of one of the main things about his character that he has to combat and overcome and deal with over the events of his storylines throughout the series. And something that I think was satisfied really well in the final book, and would have been satisfied better if A Fire Within the Ways was within them. That's a totally different topic anyway. But, you get to see a little bit of Perrin actually, that mode is made a little bit more explicit with his character in this prologue, which may or may not be a good thing. Maybe making it super obvious isn't necessarily the way to go, but that's something that I enjoyed getting to see from Egwene's perspective. You get to view a little bit, again, Mat's inclination towards getting himself into trouble, the shenanigans that he and Rand get up to. You get a little bit of hints at what their characters are like in that way, as opposed to in the main series where it's a little bit slightly more like retrospective in nature. It's like, remember when you guys would get into trouble, or are you guys still getting into trouble, or, the teenage kind of trouble, as opposed to this is more like a preteen type of trouble, and that's a little bit different. At one point, you also get to see Rand's willingness to go along with Matt from Egwene's perspective here. And like I said, just being able to view all of this from that extra perspective is nice. Do I think that this prologue necessarily needs to be there for a first-time reader? For some of these reasons, I could see the argument for it, but the rest of Ravens is about a topic that I think is a little bit much for a first-timer. You know, the actual prologue of the book being about the breaking of the world when Lucer and Telamon goes insane is, well, you know, it's already a lot. Like, it's already a bit much for a first-time reader, you know? It's not like the most complicated prologue in the world, but it's already a little bit much. And if you have that going on, but then you also do what the rest of Ravens is doing, which is basically summarizing a little bit of the legends regarding the end of the Age of Legends, being told by Tam Althor, Rand's father, tells the boys about this, and Egwene happens to be eavesdropping nearby. You get to hear a little bit about the sealing of the Dark One and the Forsaken at the Boar in Shayol Ghul. And like, this is cool. I think it's good material, but paired along with the other actual prologue of the book, both of these sets of information is, I think, probably arguably a bit too much for right at the very beginning. None of it's going to mean anything, and to me it meant a little bit more having finished the book, you know, with so much extra context regarding the sealing of the Boar and the way that the Boar and Shayol Ghul actually function, you know, especially after finishing A Memory of Light. Like, that's something that matters a lot more after the fact, and so having it at the very beginning of the series I don't think fully works. You know, it might have been, you know, a fun little curiosity thing, given that it was written by Robert Jordan. Robert Jordan obviously didn't finish the series, so you were getting a little bit of a look at some of that material in an extra context, in a ancillary context. Is ancillary the right word? It's probably not, but you know, you're getting a little bit of that material from Robert Jordan himself, which, you know, it is cool. Like, I'm not saying that it's not, but I'm not entirely sure that it's fitting for first-time readers. So, you know, I have mixed feelings about Ravens in this way. I think it's good material in and of itself. I think it's enjoyable enough, but I also think that it's a little bit too long, you know, being a little bonus prologue, taking me over an hour to read, compared to the actual prologue of Eye of the World, which, if I'm remembering correctly, only took me about 15 minutes to read. You know, having about an hour and a half of this material where no small amount of it is just this broader scope lore stuff, I don't think all of that is fully necessary for a new reader. You know, I got by just fine without this material, and this material, when it's actually relevant and important much later in the series, is, you know, good to know. But at this point early on, I wouldn't say that a first-time reader should necessarily be, you know, going out of their way to read it. Like, if it's in your edition, you want to read it, fine, but don't feel like you have to, is basically the way I feel about that. Compare that to the Strike at Shayol Ghul, which, again, you know, is kind of an extra bit of lore, an in-world lore document, is also very cool. You know, little can be apparently directly confirmed about what happened at Shayol Ghul. The text document itself basically says this. It's like, there's various different reasons why we can't really know for sure what happened, but we can, like, make some educated guesses about certain things regarding how Lews Therin and his 100 companions actually sealed the Boar. Again, having read this right after Ravens, actually, like, covering a little bit of that material in a different way was pretty neat. But, you know, getting a summary of what his plans were, and how he had to make do without full support, and the reasons why some of that full support wasn't actually given. Like, there's just a lot of, like, technical lore details that we get regarding that event that is really neat. And again, it's, I think, going to be more impactful the more that you actively know and understand about the Boar and about Shayol Ghul and about the Dark One, about some of the lore pieces of what's going on. You know, the Seangrial, of course, that permit use of the massive amounts of power. Get information about how those were made, why they were made, the Terangrial to access them alongside so that they couldn't just be used without those Terangrial. The complications with some of those because of Forsaken activities interrupting the developments of those things, but like sort of accidentally because they didn't actually know about the development of those devices in the first place, which is, you know, an interesting dynamic with the Forsaken that is like implied at in the document here. You get a slight bit of extra information about the disagreement between the Aes Sedai, the male Aes Sedai and the female Aes Sedai regarding the, you know, actual manner of imprisoning the Dark One that Lews Therin planned to do, with concerns about what the failure of it would actually mean at the forefront of that disagreement. Of course, like I said, Lews Therin getting support from the other male Aes Sedai and building a small army in secret before actually going to the board to deal with it himself, because he's not going to get the support from the female Aes Sedai in any of this. You know, we get to get slight more information of, I guess you could say, maybe not like actually how it happened, but at least like the more direct theory regarding how the male half of the One Power, how saidin was tainted in the process of sealing the Dark One, how the Dark One was sealed and the Forsaken just kind of happened to all be at the boar as well, so they were sealed alongside the Dark One. You know, Lews Therin and his companions going insane instantly is something that is actually directly told to us in this document, which I don't think is actually revealed in so straight terms at any point in the actual series. So that's a little bit of an interesting bit of information that I got, you know, and of course all of these male channelers going insane instantly, and that sparking the breaking of the world. It all makes sense why the breaking of the world happens, and it makes sense in a more explicit manner how and why that actually came about as a result of reading The Strike at Shayol Ghul. So, like, reading this at some point in the middle of the series could be useful for certain reasons at various different points in time. I'm sure there are other recommended places to read it outside of my recommended After Gathering Storm or A Memory of Light. I have not, like, actually coordinated anybody else's information regarding this stuff to determine what would be more worth it in this way. But, yeah, my general opinion is that the more you know before you actually read the document, the better, because it'll reveal a little bit more of what's in the gaps, and, like, that's cool. But also, none of it is necessarily necessary to understand what's actually going on in the series. It's just kind of cool extra information, and being told in this sort of in-world lore document kind of way makes that work out, in my opinion. Next up is River of Souls, which is, like I said, it is the canon, like, short stories worth of scenes that were cut from A Memory of Light for pacing and focus reasons. What were the reasons for this? Well, it is because River of Souls is focused on telling us, the readers, who Demandred is, and actually making that very explicit. This is one of my complaints with A Memory of Light that I made while I was doing the diaries for the book. One of them was when the Sharans show up and kind of ruin all the hopes and dreams of the Aes Sedai doing all of their stuff in, man, what's the place called already? I've already forgotten. Kandor. There's just too many names, and anyway, it doesn't really matter. The Sharans show up in Kandor, and it turns out that Demandred is the leader of the Sharans. Now, I did have somebody comment, and I was saying, LMAO, Demandred's dealings with the Sharans have actually been hinted at various different times in the series. Debatable. Even if you make that argument, and even if I agree with you in that it is considered foreshadowing to use those dealings as the foreshadowing for this to work out, I'm going to make one bugaboo about that particular claim because of one reason. That is because passive foreshadowing and active foreshadowing are sort of two different things. And the way that the Sharans are dealt with in the series, the way that Demandred is dealt with in the series after the retcon was made that he was no longer Taim, these decisions are all passive foreshadowing at some point. Whenever the Sharans are mentioned, I didn't even remember that the Sharans are even mentioned at any point throughout the series because they're ancillary. They are completely outside the realm of the actual series and what is relevant, that such a thing just being referenced a handful of times to basically any degree within any of the books was not something that I, and probably many other readers like me, are going to necessarily latch onto. And even if you do have a particular type of personality who is going to latch on to, oh, the Sharans, who are they? And then, like, read wanting and looking for any and all references to the Sharans that could possibly exist. There are readers who do that kind of thing. I'm not necessarily one of those kinds of readers. And so passive foreshadowing with regards to Demandred's dealings with the Sharans it's not enough, So by the time you have the Sharans actually show up in the book, it's just like, who are these people? What are they doing here? What's going on? This isn't satisfying. This set of scenes, River of Souls, is the active foreshadowing that would have allowed me to completely find the actual usage of Demandred and the Sharans actively nice. I kind of mentioned it earlier. And that if these scenes were, sprinkled throughout Towers of Midnight, for example, we would have had something building and growing regarding this sort of new culture that we haven't actually seen on page or anything like that, in a way that was actively politically intriguing. And then having, the final scene where it's revealed for sure, when it's confirmed within the narration, oh yeah, the main character of this set of scenes is actually Demandred, who has disguised himself amongst the Sharans, fulfilling some of their prophecies to obtain some Seangreal to give him a lot of extra power, and now he's going to go after Rand with the help of the Sharans because they follow him because he's fulfilled a bunch of prophecies for their chosen one. These types of scenes building up in a political way in Towers of Midnight would have allowed for their suddenly showing up in Kandor halfway through A Memory of Light to be satisfying, not just a what in the world who are these people and why are they here type of thing, not in the way where they show up and I'm just like, this is what Demandred's been up to, isn't it? ? And then he reveals himself to be Demandred. It would have been more satisfying if you had these scenes in Towers of Midnight, maybe not revealed directly that Bao is Demandred, and waited for that direct confirmation actually happen when the Sharans show up on the battlefield in A Memory of Light. Then you would have had some of that active foreshadowing telling you, okay, if you don't get that this is Demandred and that's what he's doing by the end of those scenes in Towers of Midnight, and it's still a surprise to you in A Memory of Light, then that's probably on you. Whereas up to this point, them just showing up on the battlefield, I would not blame anybody for having no idea what's going on with that. Not just because I had no idea what's going on with it, but again, because there was no active foreshadowing for any of that stuff. You have little references, and you have the fact that Demandred is doing something, but nobody knows what he's doing or where. That kind of thing isn't enough for you to actually put two and two together, and if the intent is for a reveal to be satisfying, then generally there has to be a degree to which the reader can maybe possibly figure it out, or when it is revealed, they can look back on the information that they did have and figure it out, or be able to look back, like I said, hindsight 2020, and be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I don't know how I didn't figure that out. In this case, the reveal was such that I know why I didn't figure it out. It's because it was never actively foreshadowed. It wasn't actually part of, any of the lore of the series in a direct enough manner for that kind of thing to actually be, explainable or capable of being figured out without, reading the series a whole bunch or actively looking for all of the details possible. So in that way, I just kind of found that kind of thing unsatisfying. And so River of Souls, as I mentioned in the spoiler-free portion of this video, is a set of scenes that I think is not necessarily vital per se, but is something that would have allowed for me to not get hung up on the Sharans or Demandred within A Memory of Light. And it also would have been an extra little thread in Towers of Midnight that would have made, A Memory of Light even more exciting. It's just okay, what's going to happen with the Sharans in the next book now? Because, I'm pretty sure that's Demandred. I want to see what happens there. Whereas the fact that it's not there is kind of disappointing. And I don't blame Brandon Sanderson for this at all, actually. This might sound like I'm trying to implicitly harp on him for it, but I'm not. It's because these scenes were written during the sessions of A Memory of Light, and going back and including them in Towers of Midnight was impossible because that had already been published a year or 2 years prior, however long the writing process was or whatever, like, so it wasn't something that was possible to be like re-included in Towers of Midnight. That foresight wasn't there because it wasn't necessarily thought of as part of that plotting sequence. So I don't blame Brandon on that front. It's just disappointing to me that there was not some other way to include these scenes and have them in an effective and meaningful way that would have allowed for a Memory of Light to be better because of them. Because a Memory of Light would be better if these scenes existed within the main series. It's just that I also understand why they're not in a Memory of Light, because, yeah, the tone and focus of it would definitely be very, very thrown off. Like, the only way that you could do it is if, all of the material of the prologue was split out over a handful of chapters and River of Souls was actually just the prologue. And, like, I don't think that works either. So, it's one of those things where River of Souls is great. I really like all the material that it is, because it is just a Demandred and some of his dealings, just not very much of it, mind you. This is only like 17 pages or something like that. It's really short. It's just basically just a handful of scenes of him doing like the final step of what he's been doing with the Sharans. And like, that's enough. That's all that it needed to be. And that material is great. I really like it. It's just the Demandred, the very end of his dealings with the Sharans. I just wish it was in the main series. It's the only problem that I have with it. I rated it 5 out of 5, basically. I really like River of Souls. Just disappointed it's not there more fully. As for A Fire Within the Ways, this is going to be a little bit tougher to discuss, not least because I totally forgot to even write notes about the actual goings-on of the story in my phone after finishing it. But we'll see how things go. There's a handful of things that need to happen in A Memory of Light. Things that are repurposed from these scenes into the final book. Things like when the Ogier arrive and start helping out. Things like when, when the convergence on Carrion happens, basically. And the plot line associated with Caemlyn and trying to, basically, like, what's the term that I'm looking for? My brain is all in shambles at the moment. Basically just trying to deal with and shut off the access point of the ways for both Carrion and Caemlyn. Something that is like actually mentioned quite a bit in the first act of A Memory of Light. This is not a small thing, actually. It's one of the reasons why after reading A Fire Within the Ways, like, I had a slight issue with A Memory of Light retroactively. Not just because I wanted the ways to be more shown, but because the ways are, like, kind of promised to actually appear in the book in a certain way. Brandon Sanderson, I've watched some of his writing lectures on YouTube, for example, and one of the things that he has talked about on many occasions is promises and payoff, right? If you are making a promise to the reader that something is going to happen or something is going a certain way, you have to pay off that promise in some way that is actually fulfilling and satisfying in the way that the reader wants it to be, or in a way that the reader didn't realize they want it to be. And sometimes that means you're subverting that expectation, and you're doing something different instead. That's a lot harder to pull off, but generally speaking, there has to be some manner of payoff. If you're making a promise that is never paid off, and that doesn't do anything and is just kind of forgotten and left hanging, that is kind of a problem with the way that the book is actually constructed. That is a problem with the expectations that you're making within your own reader's heart, and thus working against yourself in the process. A Memory of Light in the first act makes plenty of implicit promises about the importance of the ways regarding Caemlyn. Like, the entire point of the Caemlyn front of the battle is to retake the city and to retake the way through which a bunch of Trollocs managed to get into the city through the ways. Is to retake that, shut off that access point, and therefore that front of the war is done. And well, that promise is made quite often. It is made quite regularly and repeatedly, but then it isn't paid off because the ways are never used I mean, that's not necessarily necessary for this to happen, but the way that A Fire Within the Ways handles this particular topic is by utilizing the ways accessed through Carrion, finding their way, characters like Perrin and his party, finding their way from Carrion over to Camelin, shutting off the access to the ways by destroying all the bridges that get to the island where the gateway actually is there, and then returning back to Carrion, and then doing the same thing there, breaking all those bridges so that that waypoint is also no longer accessible, and then that's taken care of. And so you have that promise of what to do with Camelin and the ways paid off, and also you're doing the same thing in Carrion, so now like this entire front of the war basically is actually concluded by doing this in A Fire Within the Ways. So why is it not in the book? Because of a lot of technical reasons. Brandon explains it within the portion of the text, because it's included in one of the Unfettered collections. A Fire Within the Ways, I think, is an Unfettered 3, a collection of short stories, or a collection of stories, I guess, by fantasy authors and edited by Sean Speakman, I think. And there's a little bit of a prelude to that story, and then there's a little bit of a postscript, and the prelude basically says, like, you know, I could explain right now, but read the story and then we'll explain afterwards, or I'll explain afterwards why these scenes were actually cut. And he goes into some of the technical detail regarding it, and part of, you know, what he talked about was something that I've already mentioned here, that is that it already took a lot of time to get this sequence of scenes to where it was, and I could see why, because it's technically pretty complicated, and there's also, you know, a lot of little things that have to work for the scene to actually work. And I think that the time put into that to make it work as well as it does was good. It's appreciated. I think that it works out well enough for me to be convinced personally, even if there's a little bit of messiness, technically speaking. But the real issue wasn't even just like how much time it took, it was that it wasn't fully working from a timeline perspective. And if you read A Memory of Light and then you read A Fire Within the Ways, it makes sense what the timeline issues are. Now, I don't know like what the actual full timeline looks like, but basically what it comes down to, in my opinion, is that Perrin leaves the party and goes into the Wolf Dream with Ghul, leaving his armies under the command of Tam al'Thor before anybody actually makes it to Carrion, if I'm not mistaken. I think it happens a good bit before they actually make it to Carrion. So for Perrin and his party, including Tam and some of them, and Ghul, by the way, going into the ways at Carrion and then, you know, circling back around to Camelin is a little bit of a, like, question mark there. You might look at that and be like, obviously the timing of that doesn't really work out if that's the case. The only issue with that is that there is a way to actually make this work anyway, and that is by allowing some of the channelers to just make a gateway big enough for the 50 or something people that need to go through to get to Carrion, so that they could just go into the ways directly, do the thing, and then when they come out, the channelers make another gateway to get everybody back to the main group while they are still, you know, retreating to Carrion. And then you have the introduction of the Ogier, which is more satisfying within A Fire Within the Ways than it is in the main book. You could have that in there and them still be, you know, part of the main group as normal, and then you could still have Perrin decide, like, after the ways are dealt with, it's just like, okay, we've dealt with this major problem with this front of the war. Now we just, I have to go into the Wolf Dream. I have to go help Rand. Tam, you're in charge of the armies now. I think that there's a way to organize some of these things to actually make the timing of things generally work out. Like I said, I'm not suggesting that this would have been easy. I'm not suggesting that this is something that necessarily was, like, you know, low-hanging fruit or anything, like the scenes were thrown away for no reason, and or any complaints like that. Like, I get it, because it would have taken like a lot more work to actually make some of the events here happen the way that they happen in A Fire Within the Ways, including something like the way that Perrin learns that it wasn't actually the Trollocs that killed his family, for example. That it was Padan Fain that killed his family. The particular character who tells him that, and his fate in A Fire Within the Ways, is better in A Fire Within the Ways than the revelation of that information is in the main book, because in the main book it's basically just this character tells Perrin right before he goes into the wolf dream, it's just like, hey, you need to know this thing, and Perrin's just like, okay, what use am I going to make of that information right now, and then leaves. Whereas in A Fire Within the Ways, there's a little bit more implicit emotionality to that, and like I said, the character's fate is a little bit more fitting because he like reasons that like will make sense if you read the story. I'm sorry to be so like offhand about it, but like you can't really explain some of it. There's also the fact that Perrin's leadership, this is something that Brandon also kind of noted, I think, within the postscript of the story, is that Perrin's leadership, his role as a leader, and him being able to bring together disparate peoples under a banner, and like the borders associated with these people's paths have like washed away. They just follow Perrin. They trust Perrin. Perrin being a natural leader, that part of his character arc is actually handled really well in A Fire Within the Ways, whereas you don't really get any satisfaction with that in the main book itself. So like there's just a lot of little things that are better here than they are in the actual book, and that like retroactively made me slightly disappointed within certain aspects of the actual book, because I realized that they could have been done in this way that are better, even if it took a heck of a lot more time and effort to actually make A Fire Within the Ways work within the book. Like I said, I'm not at all trying to suggest that it would have been easy to make it work, because it would not have been. It probably would have taken a heck of a lot of time and care and attention, way more time and care and attention than these scenes had already gotten by then, to make work. And probably during the writing process of A Memory of Light, it was probably considered, what's the fallacy called? The lost time fallacy or whatever. You know the fallacy that I'm talking about. The one where the sunk cost fallacy, I think is what it's actually called, where, you know, Brandon didn't go ahead and be like, well, I've already spent this much time dealing with these scenes, I might as well just go all the way and make them fully work, right? Like, I'm not suggesting that he should have necessarily done that. I just wish there was a version of A Memory of Light that somehow incorporated that somehow. It would be very difficult to make work, I fully acknowledge that, but that's how good these scenes are, like content wise, and like even to the subtleties of some of the things that are actually going on, I think are just handled that much better. You also get a little bit more of a look at like the Dreadlords, for example, because the Dreadlords make an appearance in A Fire Within the Ways, and I don't think you really get a look at the Dreadlords until you're in Shayol Ghul in A Memory of Light, and I don't think that happens until like the back half of the book, you know, probably after Perrin's already dealt with, you know, stuff in the Wolf Dream by that point. So having a little bit more of that like built up, you know, extra material that's like, okay, there are these Dreadlords, there are these male Aiel channelers about, and they're like being utilized in more than one place. They're not just at the boar or anything, like, you know, there's just a bunch of little things that I appreciate a lot about A Fire Within the Ways, even if, again, it just would have taken so much extra work to actually make it work. I just wish that had somehow managed to be the case, because it's really great. But I guess that's going to be the end of this diary. I don't really know what the entire point of this was, besides just me getting to talk about my experience with some of this extra material. So I'll go ahead and cut this diary off here. Penultimate episode of the Wheel of Time Diaries. Final episode, if I'm not mistaken, should be next week, I think. And I will be covering the last trilogy of the Wheel of Time. I'll also very briefly be discussing some of what I've already discussed today as well, kind of in the same basically spoiler-free way that I've done with various different arcs of the series. I covered the first 3 books together in a video, I covered this next 3 books, I covered the next 5 books, and now I'm going to cover the final 3 books plus some of this bonus material all at once. And so that'll probably be next week, but for now, I think I've spent a little bit more time on this diary than I was anticipating I would be able to, but I think it went all right. I hope so anyway, and I hope you agree. But in either case, for now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.